3 years, however long this project's been in development, so it's really nice to come here today and see the culmination. Now, I'm curator at the Swindon Museum and Art Gallery, and I'm not going to lecture you about modern art. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how the collection developed in Swindon, and I'm also going to show you some of the key works from the exhibition so you can start feeling more familiar with it. As Jennifer said, this is part of the Frameworks project, and when I've gone to Bristol and when I've gone to Cheltenham to talk about the works they've got on loan, I've made reference to the Turners, but because in the Holburne you always like to do things differently, you've got the Turners at the same time as this project. So you have both the Frameworks projects here at the same time, which would be a really nice contrast, I think. When we took Turner, we had to integrate him into a modern British collection, which was fun, quite interesting. So let's start with some pictures, because you've had that screen for long enough. Swindon Museum and Art Gallery. Okay, Swindon, of course there are connotations about Swindon. Swindon is a much newer town than many in the southwest, and a very, very different town to Bath, to Cheltenham, to Bristol. And I won't labour that for too long because I find it a little bit boring trying to defend Swindon. Essentially, Swindon is a very different type of place. Swindon, and the building on the left, that's the Museum and Art Gallery, the building we currently inhabit, which sits up in the old town area of Swindon. Up until the early 19th century, Swindon was essentially a very small farming village, small town. We sold cattle, we had a bit of quarrying going on, there was a nice canal. But a small town until, as the story goes, Brunel was travelling past by train and either identified the exact location based on gradients and distance where the railway work should go, or in the more romantic version of the story, threw his sandwich out the window of the moving train where the sandwich landed. He ended up constructing one of the largest railway works in the entire world. And at that point, Swindon goes from a sleepy farming town to a Victorian boom town in many ways, a town which expanded at a huge pace. We have giant railway works, and those buildings still dominate the town now. We have the railway village, which is the little rows of Victorian workers' cottages that you might see if you go through on the railway. Churches were built, the Mechanics Institute Trust was built, hydrotherapy baths were built. So suddenly Swindon became this very different place, a place with a large, mostly working class, skilled population, a town that was growing very quickly, but a town that didn't really have all those kind of big cultural infrastructure things that larger and more established places have. So if you go to Swindon, you'll see very few buildings with pillars and pediments and people's names above the door. We don't have that kind of cultural tradition. That's not to say that there isn't a cultural tradition, but it comes out of what happened with the arrival of the GWR. So the building on the left, which is Apsley House, which is our museum of many, many staircases and limited parking, but with a great collection inside. It was part of Old Town, and it was a coal merchant's house for many years. But in 1909, a gentleman called Charles Gore, who was an amateur geologist and collector, you know, one of those wonderfully Victorian collectors who collect everything. He had kind of put together huge collections of geology, archaeology, musical instruments, some weaponry, you know, a little bit of everything. He went to Swindon and said, you know, you don't have a museum. If I give you my collections and you're willing to find a building to put them in, then that can be Swindon's museum. And we found a building. It wasn't the building we're currently in, but one down in the town centre. We put Charles Gore's collections on display. We made him honorary curator, so we must have been reasonably impressed by him. And Swindon's museum starts there. And some years later, we move up the hill. It's actually the painting on the right, which is a Swindon artist called Charles Harold Dearden. It's not in the exhibition. It's very much of its time, quite sweet. But it shows the part of Old Town we're actually in. The chapel on the right was demolished. We do like demolishing old buildings in Swindon, unfortunately. But that just gives you a rough idea of where the museum currently is. But we just had a museum. We had more ammonites than he could shake a stick at, but we didn't have an art collection. And the time when the art collection starts, it starts through a number of initiatives. So one of the key moments is when Lord Methuen, who, being connected to Bath, you might know the name quite well, the artist over at Corsham, he came to address the Workers' Committee of the GWR, noticed that Swindon didn't have a gallery, and said Swindon needs an art gallery, and sort of lodged in people's minds, and they started to think, well, yes, we do need an art gallery, but how do you go about establishing an art collection from nothing? What do you collect? Why do you collect it? Where do you put it? And there were some bequests made by Swindonians, including a Swindon milkman, gave quite a lot of money to the town, and that helped set up our purchase fund. And we started collecting quite traditional British art from the late 19th century and early 20th century. But this beautiful Lord Methuen on the right, which features in our next exhibition, the Theatre Royal here in Bath, that quite striking angle looking up at the building. And on the left, we've got Claude Francis Barry's Tower Bridge of London, which is a massive, massive painting. Part of the series he did, influenced by seeing the Blitz in London. You can see the searchlights, you can see the little explosions in the sky. It's a very almost pointillist way of painting. Quite an unusual artist, Barry, but quite a strong painting. And these are some of the ones we bought in the early days. So we were trying this out. We were starting to acquire, we were learning how to do it, but we still perhaps weren't sure exactly what direction we would go. It's the first work of art we ever loaned in 1947. It went over to Venice with the British Council. So exciting things started to happen with the art collection quite quickly. Although it remained a very small collection, it was maybe 40 to 50 works at that point. So by the 1960s, we felt we needed a bit of direction, and we thought about bringing in someone to give us some professional advice. Initially, Sir Lawrence Gowing, who was an artist who was connected with the Tate Gallery, acted as a curatorial advisor, but only for about 4 or 5 months. His wife was pregnant. He already felt he had quite a lot on his plate, which is perfectly reasonable. But he had a young curator in his employ at the Tate called Richard Morford. And Richard Morford came on board and he advised Swindon for around 40 years, so a really important figure in the history of the collection, and he continues to be an important influence now. So Richard Morford, perhaps best known, if not infamous, for some of the collecting decisions he made at the Tate. He was the curator in charge when they bought the famous pile of bricks, of course, but also the curator who had to fight really, really hard to get the first Roy Lichtenstein painting into a public collection in Britain. So quite a brave curator, not scared of making quite challenging decisions in terms of what he acquired. And he started advising Swindon. So these are 2 of the works which are in the exhibition upstairs, which came about through Morford's advice. And I guess this is a chance to start talking about kind of how the exhibition works. And I think Jennifer gave some really good information about perhaps what's different about this exhibition. And she talked about how there isn't a lot of text. And I think it's because Dexter trusts the visitor, and indeed trusts all of you, that you will make the connections for yourself, and there are no wrong connections, there are just different connections. And when Dexter first came to see the collection at Swindon, it was not a collection he knew particularly well, and he wanted to see everything. He wanted to rummage through our stores, our racks. He had some ideas. He really wanted to perhaps rediscover an artist that people haven't heard of for quite some time, and I think he's done that with a couple of people. But for him, the kind of starting point of his thinking for the exhibition was these 2 works, these 2 very different works. One on the left is Standing Woman by Duncan Grant, and the one on the right, Alfred Wallace's Ship and the Little Rose, and we all like Alfred Wallace. His pictures are absolutely lovely. Really interesting to compare that to the Christopher Wood, because you can see the influence Wallace had on everyone. The boat looks like it has sailed from Wallace's canvas into the harbour at the back of Woods. So Duncan Grant, part of the Bloomsbury group, connected to Vanessa Bell, Roger Fry, other people are in our collection. And Alfred Wallace, in a way, connected to St Ives, but really the sort of mascot, sort of spirit guide to the St Ives group, in that he is in St Ives painting pictures of boats, trying to find an incredibly authentic way of recording the world he sees and his memories of being, you know, a kind of illiterate cabin boy on a ship at the age of about 14. He's got one of really wonderful life stories, worth looking up. There's not very many dull facts about Alfred Wallace. But he's painting, and then he's discovered by people like Nicholson and Wood, and becomes this real inspiration for them in terms of trying to find a new way of painting. And their new way is to try and find that kind of authenticity which isn't defined by styles they were taught at art school. But for Dexter, he saw it not in terms of all that art historical context. He saw a woman standing on the shore and the ship sailing in the distance, and he thought about the relationship between those two subjects. I mean, there are connections in terms of the colours, there's a similarity in terms of the grey blue and the browny yellow, although they've been inverted. In fact, in the Wallace you'll see this, and it's a lovely work to look up close. The yellowy background is actually just the colour of the cardboard, and the masts and the rigging on the ship have been drawn in with pencil, and you can see those little details. But for Dexter, he found this new connection between those works, which was quite interesting. And in a way, it chimes exactly with what Richard Morford tried to do when he helped us collect. We've never had a tick list of every British artist of the 20th century, which are working our way through, because, like virtually every museum in this country, we can afford to do that. You know, modern British art is growing in popularity through the auction houses. You don't have a Lowry in your exhibition, but one of our Lowrys has gone on loan to the Victoria Art Gallery. And the first Lowry we got from Jimmy Bomford, he still has the original price label on the back, and he still paid £4,500 for it. And recently, at auction, Lowrys are now creeping above £1 million for a sort of standard size painting. So it's not like we can say, oh, we really want a Francis Bacon, let's go out and get one. But that was never how Morford saw the collection developing. He speaks in a way that I think chimes with Dexter's ideas of an open-ended network of connections. So when we collect a work, we're seeing what it says to the other works already in our collection. You know, how does it contrast what we already have? How does it offer a new perspective? Is there any kind of dialogue? And so you will have seen this picture quite a lot because it's been used in an awful lot of publicity. We use it quite a lot ourselves because it's out of copyright, which shouldn't be a consideration, but when you have a modern British collection and you have 500 works, you know exactly which 19 are out of copyright and that you can use quite easily without protracted legal negotiation. So fortunately, this absolutely lovely painting, and it is a gorgeous little painting, we can use and share with you. And it's very visually strong. I think Jennifer's spoken quite a bit about this, so I won't go into too much detail, but you know, it does an awful lot, and it's just got these gorgeous colours, and it's very cheerful, it's very inviting, and it's a pleasure to look at now. It's another work with a connection to the sea, and another work which is sort of about here and there and home and away, and fortunately we never went for the title Home and Away for this exhibition because I don't think you would ever hear the end of it if we had. But Home and Abroad, here we've got outside space, inside space, reality, fantasy, and it's this amazing still life by Edward Wadsworth called Bright Intervals. Wadsworth, an artist with a connection to World War I. Lots of the artists actually in our collection were involved quite heavily with World War I, and it does seem to have this profound influence on their art. For Wadsworth, during the war, he was involved in painting the dazzle ships. And if you don't know what dazzle ships are, it's where ships were painted with what looks like incredibly abstract graffiti in order to hinder enemies being able to pinpoint distance and speed, and so offer a level of defence for these ships. And I sometimes wonder what effect that had on Wadsworth to basically take an actual ship, a real object that exists in the world, and transform it into this fantastical work of art. Afterwards, his art kind of plays with reality and fantasy again. So Bright Intervals is quite an interesting work because it is an incredibly precise work, and you're probably getting a sense of that precision even on the slide. The way that he has rendered, for instance, that little coil of torn blueprint paper, the sheen on that piece of ribbon, the texture on the shell, and it all seems very, very precise and accurate. But the moment you start thinking about how those objects exist in that space, how any of it balances or comes together, and indeed the relationship between this still life and the scene behind, the work suddenly becomes quite weird in a really interesting way. It's almost playing with what you're expecting. And that combined with the colour, I think, makes for a work which is just exciting to look at. These are both upstairs. You've borrowed both of our lovely Graham Sutherlands. Work on the left, landscape with rocks from 44. Work on the right, Dark Hill from 1940. Both of these are Pembrokeshire landscapes. Sutherland, of course, obsessed with the Welsh landscape. He goes to Pembrokeshire for the first time in the 20s or 30s and is just blown away by this landscape, and it completely informs the way he paints from then on. And he tries to find a way of painting the landscape. If you know Pembrokeshire, it's a beautiful part of the world, but it's a very unusual landscape. You've got these shadows, it's quite a rough-hewn landscape. And Southern was trying to find an entirely new way of painting the landscape, which captured his experience of being in the landscape. And these two paintings we actually had on display at the same time as Turner's watercolours. And it's an interesting comparison because, in a way, Sutherland is facing the same challenge that Turner faced, which is how do you not only depict a landscape, but how do you communicate the feeling of being in that landscape? So for Turner, who is the master of light, of shade, of weather, you can really feel in a lot of those early watercolours just what it is like to be there, what he was feeling when he was sketching. For Sutherland, he's trying to capture those kind of dark shadows chasing across the landscape, the slightly surreal appearance of these little hills and round trees. But there are those links back, even between two exhibitions, so you can really push it and see just how many links you can create into this whole museum. Another lovely work which is in the exhibition is Ida Hitchin's Spring in Eden. And one of the things, I don't think there is something that clearly unites the work that is in the exhibition, except that a lot of the pictures are doing an awful lot of things at the same time. Kind of multitasking works, to use a horrible expression. But Ida Hitchin's Spring in Eden is this incredibly light, colourful work which is a still life. You can see the bowl of fruit, you can see the torso on the little platform, you've got a mirror. But it's also a work which is experimenting with the depiction of space, experimenting with the depiction of light, and also just playing around with painting in a way which is quite enjoyable for the viewer to experience. You can feel the artist having fun with this picture in a way. Another very painterly work in the exhibition is this one by David Bomberg, which is the southeast corner of Jerusalem. Bomberg, an artist, was profoundly affected by World War I. Before World War I, he's better known as an abstract painter. If you go to see the exhibition at Bristol Museum and Art Gallery, they have 5 works from our collection alongside about 8 or 9 from theirs, including a really gorgeous early Bomberg with one of those block-like figures lumping about the canvas. And he goes to war. After the war, he has this real kind of crisis about what and how to paint. And he struggles to find subjects to paint that feel right to him. And eventually he is able to go to Jerusalem. He's funded to go to Jerusalem, and he has, you know, sort of road to Damascus moment really, because he is out there in Jerusalem with these huge, bright skies above, casting these bluish shadows on this rocky landscape, and it just suddenly strikes him that this is how he wants to paint from then on. Again, another interesting work, a surprisingly complicated work, in that Bomberg, beneath the surface of the paint, has worked off a very precise sketch, which then enables him to paint in an incredibly free way, so that you do have these simple paint lines that really cleverly capture the topography of that landscape, but in a way that's got kind of movement and expression, doesn't feel too map-like. Vanessa Bell, another artist in the exhibition, and this does sit on the wall, which is about the nude figure, and is one of two works which are almost linking the nude figure with the landscape. This Vanessa Bell, we're hoping this makes an odd appearance in a costume drama later this year, because the BBC are doing a costume drama about the Bloomsburys apparently. And Vanessa Bell actually painted this as part of the headboard of a bed for a friend of hers. The idea being that, you know, there should be no divide between kind of beautiful things and functional things. Why shouldn't the things we use in everyday life not be decorated and beautiful to behold? So she painted this very small little board with this nude figure in a sort of landscape. So you've got a sort of blue ground on which the figure lies, these green foliage-like marks behind, and these great satellite dish-like poppy heads sort of looming over her. So it's a deliberately decorative work in some respects, but it's still an attempt to kind of do something slightly different with the female form. Richard Hamilton interior study. Jennifer mentioned that one of the reasons that you're not able to see the gallery today is because some of the works only arrived yesterday, and yes, trying to arrange the loan of 32 works to the Holburne was quite challenging, because actually 3 of the works in the exhibition until Sunday evening were in an exhibition in Munster, Germany, which was a major retrospective of the London School. And they took this work by Richard Hamilton, which is one of his series of interior studies. Interior study B is at the tape. We've got A. Not that these things count, but they do a little bit. And this is kind of quite different. This is kind of now getting into kind of British pop art. And Hamilton's a really interesting artist, an artist I really, really like. This is this again is a work which really merits actually looking at in real life, because it is a combination of collage and painting. There are elements of magazine clippings and newspaper clippings he's pasted onto the surface of the picture. He's then added this bold area of yellow. You can see the pale blue he has painted in, and even some of his pencil lines. So quite interesting, although he's collaged, he's actually used paint and pencil to create a new perspective within those elements. So he's creating what feels like a believable space out of a series of completely unrelated images that he's found. Hodgkin's gramophone. Colours are gorgeous. This one, you almost don't need lighting in the gallery when you've got this one on display. Hodgkin had quite a lot of exhibitions recently of his prints. This is an earlier work from '66. The reason it's called gramophone, and you might find yourself having to explain why it's called gramophone. It's actually a painting. It began as a painting of a woman listening to an LP on a gramophone, which Hodgkin worked and worked and worked with more and more and more paint, until it becomes a series of quite abstract shapes, really vibrant colours, but at the same time staying strangely musical, I would say. There's something very lively and full of life about this picture. A couple of darker works, and these have actually been hung together, which is quite interesting. So the Roger Hilton on the left, in a way there's a similarity between this and Hodgkin, because sometimes people do struggle with modern art. And one of the ideas about this project we're doing this time round is to kind of remove some of that interpretation and highbrowedness and jargon that can be quite off-putting to people experiencing modern art, and getting them into a position where they can make their own decision, not feel that they have to feel one way or another. But perhaps one of the ways that people can start to understand abstraction and non-representational painting is through people like Hodgkin and Hilton, who actually do start with an image that is then developed and abstracted and exaggerated and concealed to create something which is quite far removed. But it's still got that connection back to an original image, which sometimes helps in terms of understanding why pictures look like they do. For Roger Hilton, they still be glad there is not another one listening to gramophone. This is the inspiration of seeing snowy fields in winter. So if you imagine snowy countryside where the tractors and the horses have been through and ploughed dark, muddy tracks, branches of trees, stone walls. It's that feeling of black and white and darkness that permeates his work, which is that little bolt of yellow. Dexter hoped to rediscover people, and Walter Poole, I'd argue, is someone who's rediscovered, although I think probably about 12 people in Swindon know about him, of which I'm one. He's actually a Swindon artist, so most of the artists you'll see, in fact all but Walter Poole, are not from Swindon, although their works are now in Swindon. Walter Poole is, and he's one of this group of fairly decent painters who came out of the Swindon Art School in the 40s and 50s. This is Aircraft Factory Blunsdon. Blunsdon is a village on the outskirts of Swindon, which during World War II, Spitfires were constructed along with other parts for aircraft. And this, by 47, the factory is completely ruined. It's quite an interesting little painting, and it is displayed with the Hilton, so you can see the comparison, that sense of ruin, of fading, of that kind of late wintry feeling of things breaking down and being concealed by foliage and snow. It's a nice little picture. It's not, people won't know the artist, and that's quite okay. So this really is one in which we can trust the visitor to make up their own minds completely. A couple of the nudes. So we've got Geoffrey Camp's The Berlin Gap on the left and George Warner Allen's Sleeping Venus on the right. George Warner Allen, not quite so well known now. Painter was very interested in mythology and trying to be almost a modern classical painter. He wanted to know how an artist in the 20th century could be inspired by the things that inspired Poussin or Rubens. And his way was to paint real people, real landscapes, but infused by an interest in mythological subjects. Geoffrey Camp, quite challenging painter. We've got another one of his works in our current exhibition, which is a London landscape. This is a portrait of his wife. He used to make his wife pose in these quite painful looking positions with that very, very arched back. This is a combination of a portrait and a landscape. That's kind of what it's curving round with the sea behind the figure, but it's very interesting kind of layering up those influences, and again that seems to be something that's coming up through the exhibition. So we've got Wood, who's doing still life in a seascape. We've got Geoffrey Camp, who is doing a nude in a seascape. We've got George Warner Allen, who's got a nude in a Berkshire landscape. So it's these paintings that are trying to do lots of different things at the same time. Lucian Freud was another one that rapidly crossed Europe in the last couple of days to be with you for opening tomorrow. It's an early print by Lucian Freud. And this is back from when Lucian Freud was racked with self-doubts. He thought he was an absolutely terrible artist. He wasn't very good at painting. He wasn't very good at drawing, which is quite shocking, really. But he felt his way of overcoming it was to be very, very good at seeing. So this is a portrait of his wife holding up the fig leaf in front of her face. Both she and Lucian Freud claim that there was absolutely nothing symbolic meant by this at all, but the moment a woman is holding a fig leaf, the symbolism is going to creep in whether it was meant or not. But at this point, he was really trying to capture what he saw. And so, although this is a print, this is a very, very small print run, and we're only really aware of one other of the 10 prints being out there. So, you know, although it's a print, it's still the same status as an original work of art. It's not lesser for that reason. But Freud used to inscribe directly onto the copper plate. So he sat in his hotel room with Kitty, his wife, the copper plate in front of him, Kitty there with the fig leaf, and he would just scratch directly into the copper plate. Which is what gives it this real intensity. It's that very strong line that you see a lot in very early Lucian Freud, and those gigantic eyes which he always gives Kitty. And on the right is a painting which has given Jennifer and Howard no end of headaches, because Dexter definitely wanted this in the exhibition. So they came to me when they were doing the labels and said, "What do you know about Kathleen Williams, and what do you know about this picture?" It seems that Kathleen Williams may have painted one other painting in her entire life of the wife of the head of the British Dental Association. There is no record of her. We don't know who the sitter is, only that this painting is called Refugee and that it was painted in 1943. So this incredibly mysterious, melancholic, beautiful portrait, again, people will just have to respond to, which I think is what Dexter wants to do. There is text in the exhibition, and Dexter's essay is excellent, but we can trust in the visitors to just find their own links in this exhibition, as I'm sure you're starting to do already. Some works on paper, Gwen John on the left, our lovely Gwen John, and on the right, Augustus John's classical scene, brother and sister, of course. The Gwen John sketch, very influenced by sort of Japanese engravings, lots of areas where you see nothing but the colour of the paper showing through, very simple use of pencil line on the blouse, and the face seems to just be worked with almost the absolute bare minimum of brushstrokes. It's a really extraordinary portrait, and it's quite interesting when you see it on the wall, because it's a very small work, but it has real power. You can feel this figure looking back at you. So I'll be quite interested to see what people think of that when they see it in the flesh. Michael Craig Martin's The Box That Never Closes on the left, and Leon Kossel's Booking Hall on the right. So we do have some of the London School represented in the exhibition, and indeed most of those groups associated with British art in the 20th century, be it the Camden Town Group, Bloomsbury, St Ives, are reflected. So there are a couple of works by Leon Kossov. It's incredibly aggressive drawing, in which he's not only sketched this busy booking hall, and you can feel this kind of frantic early morning rush to it, but the entire surface is flecked with oil paint. And he did a series of these booking halls, and if you go and see the others, you could almost kind of link up where this paint splatter has crossed two pieces of paper. Michael Craig Martin, one of the reasons Spencer's mentioned that it needs a bit of attention, Michael Craig Martin has very strong feelings about how works like this should be displayed. If you ever go up to Tate Britain, he kind of did three works similar to this. There is The Box That Never Closes, which is in Swindon. There is A Box That Never Opens, which is in another public collection. And then there is a series of 4 smaller boxes in various stages of opening and closing, which Tate Britain currently has on display. He doesn't like cordons. He doesn't like raised platforms. He doesn't want glass cases. He wants it to exist within the gallery space, which we completely empathise is tricky. It's one of the reasons it hasn't perhaps been on display in Swindon as much as it could, because it doesn't necessarily work well with a group of 60 school children, not least who want to see what's inside. And there's nothing inside. It doesn't close, but it is hinged, so the 2 parts can be opened in a variety of ways. And it's a bit of minimalist sculpture. It's a work that can actually move. It's a work that, in a weird way, kind of chimes back to the Richard Hamilton, in that Michael Craig Martin was quite fascinated by consumerism and the kind of rise of white goods. So it's actually this really kind of smooth, shiny white melamine appearance to it. But yes, that's it. Dexter's decision. Take it up with him if it becomes too tricky.